Hey everybody, welcome back. Another episode of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
I'm Nick Saveri.
Nicholas, my friend, we are back again. How are you, sir? How's everything going?
Things are good, man. Things are good. It's been a good week. A lot going on. We got Rutgers basketball Friday.
Oh, yeah.
Our Scarlet Knights are in the tournament. Selection Sunday for the first time in a long time, actually in my life. Not
30
my
years.
lifetime. I'm
30
42,
years.
but yeah, and I don't certainly remember 30 years ago. So just to hear them get named, they got a game against Clemson this Friday. Excited about that, man. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. I mean, that is, for me as a longtime season ticket holder and just a fan of the program for so long, I feel like I've been telling all my friends since I got into Rutgers that we were going to go to the NCAA tournament. That was in 99, and now it's 2021. So I couldn't be more happy. Week's been going good. Everybody's healthy. I actually got tested yesterday for COVID-19. Potentially, I was part of a contact tracing program just to show how effective that has been going. So tested negative. So I'm doing pretty well, man. I'm glad to hear everything's going well, man. As we shift into our topic for tonight, because we're going to be covering what I think is a very interesting topic. We had my episode on the media and, all my years that I spent at Fox News, right? I gave a little bit of perspective and insight. We had Sabrina Rodriguez, who's a political immigration reporter, and what it's like to be today's female journalist. But we wanted to get somebody on to really cover from a correspondence angle, right? Covering stories over on Capitol Hill, actually interviewing lawmakers, reporting on the news of the day, fill-in anchors, and Fox News chief Washington correspondent Mike Emanuel is going to be joining us tonight. He's a Rutgers guy like us, Nick, so kudos for him there. And so we're going to be talking with Mike really about the perception of Fox News right now. I mean, let's be honest, right? It is one certain way, right? And it's really one certain way because of the opinion anchors that appear, in the 8 to 10 p.m. blocks. But Mike is one of those guys at Fox that's like your traditional newsman. Here he is reporting on news of the day, right? He's the fill-in host at Fox News Live at 1:00. He's on Capitol Hill when, Chris Wallace is throwing to him to, find out more about Biden's COVID relief plan. So what does that look like from his lens, covering an administration? What does it look like reporting on the news of the day? What has happened to Fox? We're going to ask him about, because there's a lot of perception from left and right leaning that Fox is one way or the other, to each group's eyes. So there's a lot to talk with Mike about tonight. We're excited to have him on the show. Nick, your thoughts on, I know you have checked out some of Mike's work recently. He just filled in this past Sunday on Fox News Live. Your thoughts on Mike and the topic about, being a correspondent in today's journalist world.
Yeah, and that conversation's been a hot one recently. We're hearing a lot of discussions about how the Biden administration, not having press conferences. There is going to be one obviously tomorrow, but this challenge for correspondence of what does that mean when you're basically only connecting with the press secretary, and what and the impact of that, good or bad. So that's been one of the biggest conversations lately, and we're only a couple of months into the administration. Mike brings that perspective of being someone on the field. We've talked to Sabrina, we've talked to Naveed. Obviously, our first episode was Mike, based on your own experience. And I think the media is important to cover, because when we think of the media, it's a much more larger encompassing concept than it was when we were younger, than when our, previous generation. It's no longer about just television, actually, or newspapers. All of this is connected to social media. It's all connected to programming, and you mentioned, Fox is with their 8 to 10 block. And that block speaks to a certain type of audience, to a certain type of political philosophy. Outside of that, though, if you were to observe people like Chris Wallace, Mike Emanuel, other people at the network, the political leanings are a little bit harder to glean. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, that's the world Mike operates in. Like, what is that reputation? Does that play a part for him in terms of the way he's perceived, or any correspondent is at that network, MSNBC and other networks? So I'm excited for tonight's conversation.
No, it's a great point. And it's one of the things that we wanted to have him on. So we're super excited. Can't wait to talk to Mike. All right, Nick, like we talked about at the top, our next guest, he's a Fox News chief Washington correspondent. You can catch him Sundays. I'm hosting Fox News Live at 1:00. And that is Mike Emanuel. Mike Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for being on with us tonight.
Gentlemen, thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Mike, before we get started on questions, I want to get our audience a little bit more about you. Obviously, we know you're a Jersey guy, Rutgers grad like Nick and myself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your upbringing, and why you got into news and broadcasting.
Sure. So I grew up in Westfield, New Jersey. Those familiar with the Garden State Parkway, exit 135.
There it is.
Mom and dad rode the commuter train into New York City every day. Mom worked on Wall Street. Dad was a civil engineer. I respected the heck out of what they did, how they worked so hard to provide for our family. But I wasn't particularly interested in what they did. But my mom and dad were news junkies. And so I grew up with three newspapers in the driveway: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Newark Star Ledger. And when I was eating my Cheerios in the morning, WCBS News Radio 88 was on. And so kind of the news was all around me. And so my parents said to me as I was going through high school, "Well, Michael, what do you want to do?" And I said, I love the news. I'm really interested in that. I'd love to be the guy out in the field standing there, basically telling the audience what's happening live on the scene. And so mom and dad were great supporters in terms of saying you should chase your dreams. If you have passion for it, odds are you'll be good at it. And so went to Rutgers, and my first week on campus, I picked up the Daily Targum newspaper and saw an ad for WRSU radio. And, they said, we need DJs and we need sports news, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, man, I could be on the radio. Wow, how cool is that? And so right away I went to WRSU, and all throughout school, I did sports at Rutgers and had a blast, and it got me comfortable in front of a microphone. And it was a great experience. And so it kind of started my trajectory into the business, and an incredible journey.
Wow. You brought me
back memories.
Well, I was one of the guys on the other side of WRLC in Livingston. So we basically were duct taping and, backpacking our way through AM radio back then. Mike, thank you for joining us. So obviously you're over at Fox News. To people like myself outside the media, programming in general or networks in general tend to, from an outsider's perspective, tend to fall into that like extreme category of like left, right, and all that stuff. I know that's an oversimplification, but from where you stand, what's really happening with that perception? What role, if any, does that play in your reporting, or just the kind of the makeup of the newsroom you operate from and things like that?
Well, as a Jersey guy with parents who were not involved in politics and were not involved in the media, like my dream was just to do the news. We have opinion people at Fox News who get paid a lot of money for their strong opinions, but what I do is a very different thing. And so every day I'm assigned to be as fair and as accurate as possible in my reporting. And so my bosses will come to me and say, if I'm turning in a script for a show, like, is that fair? And I'll take a closer look, and I'll make sure to say, yeah, we've got, this view from the right, this view from the left. And my opinion is not in here. I'm basically, obviously it's my human creation. So it's not perfect, but it's my experience of reporting in Washington for 20 years, reporting at the national level for nearly 25 years. And so basically, I think if you asked folks at the Obama White House, which I covered, I think they would tell you Mike was always fair. It was one thing President Obama actually told me to my face one time. I think folks at the Bush White House would tell you I was fair. They didn't always love the questions I asked, because at the White House, there are days where there are good news days for the president and his team, and there are bad news days for the president and his team. And so, sometimes they're really happy with coverage and sometimes they're not. So I think, like, during the daytime, my job is to gather the facts, craft scripts, make them interesting. Obviously, we're in a very competitive media environment. There's 500 channels. Now we got great podcasts too that can take people away from the TV set. So, I just try to do the news to the best of my ability and check my opinions at the door. And, hopefully it's worked over nearly 25 years.
Let's talk about that. You mentioned, on a bad news day or a good news day. Again, outsider here, you're in DC. in the work that you do. On a bad news day, like what's the tone like? What's the environment like? What is it like trying to put a script together, gather information? Like, what does the environment look like? If you don't mind, even sharing a story of a quote unquote bad news day, and sort of what was that situation like for everyone around?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to like when I was covering the Obama White House, I remember the Deepwater Horizon spill. And so you had like live images of, oil gushing into the ocean. And obviously, that's a tough situation. And so, that live image on all the networks, it makes it a bad news day if you're in power, if you're in charge, because it's a huge bummer, obviously. The Bush administration had those bad days. Trump administration certainly had those bad days. I was on Capitol Hill on January 6th when the riot at the Capitol happened, and I never thought I would be covering something like that in the United States of America. I've traveled to Iraq and Afghanistan and across the Middle East, and maybe in one of those countries you see a situation like that. But here it was at the United States Capitol. And so those are brutal news days, very tough news days. That actually, January 6th was an awful day for those Capitol police officers. And we lost a few of those guys either that day or in the days afterward. And so, look, I think there are days where the news is exciting and interesting. And, President's first day, President's State of the Union. I was there at President Biden's inauguration. I had a bird's eye view, and that's an exciting day. And you see people from both parties coming together and excitement about a new administration. But then the job of the American president is so big, so difficult that there are problems that crop up, like what's going on at our border right now. And so basically, I don't really, try to shade it one way or the other. I just, tell a story, and some days you can tell like they're excited about, the topics in the news, and some days they're not so excited.
Mike, obviously I worked at Fox News for years in the 04, 05, 06. So I know a little bit about the inner workings and what these anchors are like on and off air. One of the things that you mentioned that we were talking about before you jumped on was your long history, in media and reporting on the news of the day. And it's tough with the backdrop of, like you mentioned, the opinion hosts that really dominate the coverage of what Fox News is or shaped as. I'm curious for you, though, what's a misconception that you get hit with sometimes? Because like you mentioned, you're a correspondent, you're covering January 6th. There's been a lot of vitriol, even from the far right, about Fox News being too far left. So what does that look like? Give us what that looks like as a correspondent. Have you ever been met with something like that or confronted with something like that? Because I'm not as visible as you are, because I was behind the camera and you're in front of the camera.
Yeah, I covered Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016. And so a lot of places we went, a lot of her diehard supporters are not Fox News fans. And so sometimes people would confront me and say, "Oh, you're with Fox, we don't like you." And I'd say, "Have you ever seen my work?" And they would say, "No, I just don't like, Sean Hannity or Fox and Friends or one of the opinion side hosts." And so I'd say, "Well, if you ever see my work, I hope you'll give it a try. And if I'm on social media, and so if there's something you don't like, you can let me know. That's an instant way to let me know." But I think, I've come into contact with folks in my personal life outside of work who are like, "Oh, you're the Fox guy. I can't stand, certain opinion host." And I say, well, what they do and what I do are very different things. And I would encourage you to give it a try and, let me know what you think. Here's my number, text me, tell me, was that a fair story or not? And so, I think a lot of people who've gotten to know me outside of work and then watch my work go, "Oh, got it." Like, there's a big difference between the opinion side and the news side. And, I think one of the biggest compliments I get from people is when they say, "I have no idea what your politics are." And I say, that's the point. That's the whole idea for my role. The opinion folks have to have a tough opinion, a strong opinion, whatever side they're on. But like for me, if you don't know my politics, that's a victory in my book.
Well said. That's literally what we aim for on this show, and we have gotten that a few times. So I'm glad you said that.
Thank you.
Mike, when you think about Fox News, also true with CNN, MSNBC, other networks, where the opinion folks are what feel to be the faces of those networks, what does that say to the reputations of those different fields? What does it say to journalism in general when it's the opinion? And all of us, Mike, I don't know if you know this, but we all went to the School of Journalism at Rutgers. What is that saying about these networks and outlets and the media in general when we lead with the people who are giving you their take on something, but not necessarily reporting it?
Yeah, I think there needs to be, good, strong lines between the opinion side and hopefully the news side. And so I don't appear very often on the opinion shows, maybe a special night or something like that. But I think it's important to kind of draw the lines. And so people know like, oh, this is our news coverage versus this is our opinion coverage. I think the hot takes these days, whether it's news or sports, people get paid for their hot takes. And so I think there's a lot of money in there. And a lot of people with all these channels and all these different varieties are seeking out people with similar viewpoints to their own. And so we can kind of get into silos of, listening to people that we agree with and only those people, following those people on social media. And so, what I try to do when people say, what do I do? There's so much out there. And I say, sample a lot of it, find interesting podcasts, read different newspapers, read, different magazines, online or whatever, listen to different radio stations and then figure out how you feel based on the different sampling of voices you're hearing from, and formulate your own opinions. But yeah, it's interesting because I think both in news and sports media, the hot takes on the shows yelling at each other certainly generate a lot of ratings at night. And, I'm glad they can pay some of my bills. But what I do is a very different gig, so to speak.
Coming out of college, going into the media sphere, what were the big differences? Because obviously in any educational program, there are certain ideas you develop, certain skills you learn, and then you get, really on the ground and the experience is different or just far more encompassing than you thought you may have signed up for. What was that sort of Private Ryan moment I'll use from the opening of that movie for yourself?
Yeah. So, when I was coming out of Rutgers, we had, obviously the big three broadcast nets with people like Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, and Peter Jennings. And then CNN was in its infancy. And so there were limited voices out there and limited channels. And so I never had any idea that there would be a Fox News channel. I was just excited to get into the business. And so, I moved to small town America and paid my dues and bounced around. And then, I think a lot of preparation leads you to an opportunity, and all that preparation hopefully pays off that you're ready for the opportunity when it comes your way. And so the media environment now is so different than when I was starting out, for sure, when it was really, a few newspapers, a few TV networks, and that was it. Now you can find them in all, shapes and sizes, and young, old, middle of the road, whatever you want. And so it's a fascinating environment. And I think it's important for consumers to be sophisticated about, what they're watching and what they want. They've got lots of choices. Hopefully they make some good choices.
Mike, I want to stay right there because Nick likes to use this phrase a lot. Let's have a moment of literacy for the people watching and listening to us. I know the way shows are built, right? I've worked on these shows and built these shows. And I've noticed a shift, not just with shows that you've done or the networks have done, even with Jake Tapper on State of the Union. And it used to be, we have an R and a D on, we have a 4-box, we have people talking over each other. It's chaos, right? Jon Stewart alluded to it on that famous rant on Crossfire with Tucker Carlson and Paul Bagata.
I'm here to confront you because we need help from the media, and they're hurting us. I made a special effort to come on the show today because I have mentioned this show as being bad. Okay, you have a responsibility to the public discourse, and you fail miserably.
So now it's shifted to, here's 5 minutes, a Republican senator on. The next segment, a Democrat senator's on to respond to what that person said. Do we feel that that is the way news has evolved to, and that embraces dialogue more? Is that more beneficial than the previous way? Because to me, that feels like, hey, this guy said that. What do you think of this? As opposed to them saying it to each other, but I don't know the correct solution. What do you say?
That's a great question. And I'm not just blowing smoke. I mean, I think I've done both, where I've seen the right and left kind of yelling at each other on the air. And I guess that's had its place and its time. And I think maybe now some show producers are thinking, give the lawmaker 4 or 5 minutes on his or her own to fully articulate his or her views without getting stepped on by the other guest. And so, I think it's working right now. But I think these things in our business can be cyclical. And, the shout fest with right and left going at it face to face may make a comeback before long. But I think right now, I think you're right, where we've kind of like give this person their time, their take, press them with follow-up questions, and then thank them, and then bring on the other side and, give them their opportunity to make their points without getting stepped on, and then follow up. And hopefully our viewers get a good sense of where both sides are in the argument.
You've mentioned working for covering various administrations. We're now almost 2 months in to the newest administration. When you think of these different administrations you've covered for the first couple of months when they've gotten started, what are some things that you notice in terms of trends? Like, what does it feel like shifting from one administration to another? And what you're seeing so far, what has stood out from this administration? What has felt different? I totally violate all my rules of journalism with this multi-layered question. I apologize, but
all good.
But what feels similar? What feels different? Comparing just sort of the different experiences you've had with these administrations you've covered.
Yeah, I think what's been interesting is the Biden administration in some ways feels like the Obama administration 2.0. President Biden feels very comfortable with all those people he worked with for 8 years with President Obama. And so we've seen a lot of faces come back, and maybe they're not in the exact same job, but they're in interesting posts, and they're people that the president trusts. And so it makes sense that he would put them around him. So in some respects, they are starting from a good place because they have a lot of experienced hands that have been through this before. I think when you saw the Trump administration come in, total political outsider, a lot of people, even I think in his inner circle, weren't sure that he was going to win. And so all of a sudden you're trying to build a government from a businessman's perspective. And so I think that was a little bit, there were some growing pains in terms of getting people in, getting people up to speed. This is how you govern, and that sort of thing. And so I was here I got to Washington with the Bush administration, 43. And so what you saw was he brought in a lot of his dad's former inner circle type folks. And so he had that kind of, experienced hands coming in. And so I think that makes the starting point a little bit easier with their people who have been confirmed to positions before by the United States Senate, also have worked in government at high levels and know how government works behind the scenes. But, I think if you, as American voters, hire a total political outsider, then you're going to get somebody with some creative and new approaches to governing. And I think if you hire someone who's made a career in Washington or is a relative of a president, then you may see a lot of familiar faces in the same or new places.
My recent story from The Independent talks about Fox's audience shifting, numbers changing. It's also true with, the other networks as well. The market seems to be, at least from the opinion programming standpoint, is that you're seeing, with other, even far right leaning programming, and now in the market space, how does that appeal to, or how does it affect Fox? Thinking about that, what is the network thinking in terms of, like, does it have to explore pivoting? Does it have to rethink who is it really targeting? And again, I speak to you as a person who is not in the opinion sector, but a person who's with a network that is now in an interesting space where it's actually market sharing with other networks that are even far more politically extreme than what Fox News has brought to the table?
Yeah, interesting question. And I'll tell you, we took a hit election night 2020 because I think we were first to call Arizona for Joe Biden. And looking at the map, that basically said to the audience that Joe Biden was going to be the 46th president of the United States. A lot of diehard Fox viewers were not happy with that. And so then you get into an issue of, do you tell people the truth, or do you tell people what you think they want to hear? And I don't know what you do. I wasn't making those calls. I was, on assignment that night doing my thing, and whatever the news was what I was going to talk about. But I think it's an interesting and challenging dilemma, because if we'd lied to the audience that night when we had the numbers saying Joe Biden was going to win, then in a couple of weeks, when they find out that what we said election night wasn't true, then have we lost all credibility with them? I would hope so. So I think, we tried to do the right thing, and some of the audience was furious, and, hopefully they're coming back realizing that we were just doing our jobs. But a lot of folks today want to hear what they believe and want to hear what they think. And sometimes, as news people, we have to tell them things they don't want to hear. And, hopefully we have enough of a track record with our audience where they go, okay, I wasn't thrilled with the coverage that night, but it was true. And they come back. But it's an interesting dilemma. And I'm glad I'm not in those executive meetings to figure out how to navigate all that.
I mean, just from experience, I think the election desk started kind of when I was around at that time in 2004. And I was telling people, if Fox's election desk is calling Arizona, it's in the bag for Joe Biden, because they have the best election desk out in the business. So it's funny that you mentioned about that. Mike, before we let you go, you've been fantastic and appreciate the time you've given us. What's one thing you would want to impart on people, or at least leave for people that watch correspondents, they watch news journalists, anchors out there? What's a message that you would give to them in terms of news judgment?
I think the vast majority of us want to get it right. I think, we all have our opinions, and, like I said, as a news person, I try to filter mine out, to leave them, check them at the door. But I think, over time, if you watch somebody's work and watch it closely, I think you're going to get a sense of whether that person's trustworthy or not. And I think, it's wise to sample and to, see who out there you like and who you respect, and check them out over time and see if they live up to your standards day after day after day. Because I think that's the challenge. The business. You can have a great night tonight, do a great show. Well, then tomorrow, everybody's asking, what are we going to do tonight? And so there's a great challenge of being consistent and professional day in and day out. It's something I try to live up to every day with relentless preparation. And I think to the audience, study us and really hold us to the fire. And if we let you down, let us know on social media. But hopefully more times than not, a lot of us will deliver a very professional presentation day in and day out, and make you glad that you were watching, because maybe you learned something you didn't know when you tuned in that day.
Well said, Mike. We appreciate the time you've given us tonight. Like I mentioned, Fox News Live on Sundays. You can check out Mike, and also he is a chief Washington correspondent. He's been there for 27 years at Fox News. We appreciate you coming on tonight, Mike, and all the best. Continued success to you, sir.
I'm a big fan of your podcast, gentlemen. Really thrilled to be with you. Thanks for having me.
All right. That was Fox News chief Washington correspondent, Mike Emanuel. You can check him out Sundays as he hosts Fox News Live at 1:00. Nick, there's so much there. Again, we've talked about this a bunch of times with different people that have come on from the media space, validating what I said on the first episode. For those of you who check out Inside the News Media Perspective on episode 1. But it's really, there's different things with the media that I think people just don't understand. There are news anchors, there are journalists, and then there are opinion shows. And if you only listen to the opinions from 8 to 10 p.m., primetime programming blocks, folks, you're only going to get that person's opinion. Mike is a news giver. He said it to you. He doesn't go on those opinion shows, right? He appears because they need to find out what a lawmaker said, what's actually a fact, what's actually news of the day. I love that he said that, man. What'd you take away from Mike Emanuel? And also, what'd you take away of the conversation about the evolution of Fox News and where they're going to right now?
You know, I echo what you're saying. I mean, it was a good reminder to me about the separation between reporting versus opinion. And to someone like myself who's not been in the media, like we often get caught up in that. And I mean, to take politics aside, I'll use ESPN as an example of this. We think of the most prominent people at the network, for the most part, are people who give opinions. It's not the broadcasters. Like someone like Doris Burke should be the face of ESPN and NBA coverage. It's not. It's the talking heads on First Take. It's the opinion shows between 4 and 6. That's one part of the network, but that's actually not what it's about. It's about reporting. To Mike's credit, I enjoyed that conversation. And here's me talking to someone at Fox News, and I have my own opinions in the networks I follow and such, but I'm able to have a very civil conversation. And I trusted that we're discussing journalism as a professional practice. We're talking about news as its role in society. What we're not talking about is hot takery, or at least when we are, it's in isolation of, well, that's one part of the network. And when you think of that, that's no different than other networks that do the same thing. You have an opinion engine, prime time, as you put it, but then you have portions of the day where you have actual reporting going on. It was a refreshing conversation.
No, and one of the things that he said is it's just like, and you just echoed it as well. It's like, I can't get away from the opinion stuff, but I live on the news side of it, right? I want people to not know where I lean, because that's when you can actually trust what I'm saying, right? I think there's this, there may be some people that listen, why would you put a Fox News guy on? Or even if we were to have on a CNN person, it's like, oh, well, they lean this way, they lean that way. Not everything has a political slant to it, right? The goal of this show is really to have conversations about interesting topics and offer thoughtful conversations on it. And I think Mike gives you that lens of a guy who's been around 27 years, like he mentioned, covered the Bush administration, the Obama administration. President Obama said to him, Mike, you cover it fair. And President Obama had his issues with Fox News. Who did he have the issues with? The opinion people. You remember the interviews with Bill O'Reilly. So like there's this, and I use stigma, but it's probably the wrong connotation, but there's this distinction that, Fox News is all about Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson. Nothing else can exist from that. And I think Mike gave you a little bit of insight as to, look, I'm trying to do my job and report on news of the day. Now, here's the other problem, right? You could have people that could come back and say, well, the bad outweighs the good, right? I think Mike said it perfectly, right? Hey, if you're watching him, you don't trust that, bounce around, right? The news judgment, right? The news diet. We talked about this with Sabrina Rodriguez from Politico. It's people do not understand that a news story has factual information. These guys are reporting on it. If you don't trust it, check it from another source. That's what they do for a living. They're sourcing things, they're checking, they're verifying. It's not just, I trust this one network and I watch it 24/7 and I want nothing else to do. You have to bounce around the dial and actually source things. And I think that's what's getting lost in all of this, is consumers actually understanding what news judgment is. So I'm glad that Mike summed up a lot of that in there. Speaking of judgment on shows you should listen to, as I always try to do an interesting segue.
Well done.
Thank you. You can check out our show video-wise on YouTube. Nick's pointing down to hit subscribe. He's smashing the button, as a matter of fact. Audio platforms, you know them by now: Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, blah, 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 blah. Check us out: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, at Can We Please Talk Podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
We out here. I'm still Nick Saveri.
Thank you, everybody, for watching, checking us out. We'll see you next time.
Later.